Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we're going to continue our reading of The African Personality in America by Kobe Cambone. We're starting on page 106, which is chapter 5, African Personality Development. He's going to talk about our children, guys.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Chapter 5 starts with a quote by Kwame Nkrumah. Our war is not a war of conquest. It is a war of revolutionary liberation. We fight not only in self-defense, but to free, unite, and reconstruct. Today, we are the masters of our own fate. African Personality Development. Developmental issues for African children. It is a fact that the world society of today is much more dangerous for the African child in general and the African child in North America in particular than in the past. Most contemporary Black equals African families in their vital socialization role of African children do not provide even the slightest consciousness emphasis related to the African cultural reality, nor the reality of white European supremacy domination of African people and methods for surviving its lethal tentacles. He's saying we don't equip our kids. Nor does the so-called Black church or school, which is the formal education system, provide such vital Afrocentric socialization and training. Contributing to this overall problem is the fact that African social and cultural scientists have not yet developed Afrocentric parenting models or guidelines and prescriptions for African parents on how to raise African-centered children under the conditions of white supremacy, cultural imposition, and domination. Thus, our children are left virtually defenseless in the face of the inevitable and overwhelming anti-African confrontation that will characterize and dominate much of their lives under the current system of Eurasian world order. It is as if the African family in North America in particular, through the process of racial integration and Eurocentric miseducation of African people, has lost its racial cultural integrity, its racial cultural memory, and therefore its racial cultural consciousness. The fact is that cultural miseducation is rampant among African families because it is rampant throughout the African community. We are, as a community, virtually without any African-centered and African-controlled educational, economic, religious, or political institutions. The historically Black colleges and universities are governed by the miseducated and anti-African educational models of the Eurocentric worldview, as are the elementary and secondary educational systems of our communities. Since education would, under normal circumstances, constitute a critical seedbed for African recovery from the Ma'afa and our cultural redevelopment as diasporan African nation, then without African-controlled education, Africans are locked into a no-win situation relative to our psychological and cultural liberation from Eurocentric conceptual cultural imprisonment. We Africans must therefore develop African-centered socialization and educational models to propel the liberation and transformation process required for African self-determination and affirmation. That is, African nation building and maintenance in the modern world. Afrocentric socialization and education, in my view, must be designed to define, cultivate, and reinforce African nation building and maintenance. In order to better appreciate how we must nurture and shape the Afrocentric African personality that will have these liberating, self-affirming qualities, several critical aspects of African life in North America must be addressed and reconceptualized. First, how does the process of Europeanization of African children occur? Secondly, what constitutes the correct Africanization of our children? Thirdly, how do we, the African community, actively carry out African-centered socialization and development for African children? These critical issues will be touched on in this chapter, although not in depth, as we attempt to define the process for enhancing African self-consciousness, or ASC, development in African children. A general model of personality development of African children in North America. Based on this analysis, there is a severe deficiency of ASC development in African children, especially in North America. The notorious Eurocentric studies on early racial awareness in children, as well as the widely publicized negative social behavioral outcomes of present-day African children and adolescents, all attest to this problem. They raised some very serious questions about the appropriateness and effectiveness of contemporary African child development and practices and socialization procedures. In view of the severe critiques of African child rearing, parenting practices in America raised by this analysis, when it should and must come to constitute the appropriate cultural centered development model for African child socialization. So he's basically saying, what do we do? According to Robert Williams, writing in 1981, for Africans in America, there exists at least two significant psychological, experiential, social spaces: Afrocentric and Eurocentric social space. William uses the term Afrocentric and Algolocentric, in which personality development unfolds. Afrocentric space is vital for normal, healthy African personality development to occur. It is defined at the essential or concrete level in terms of the presence of African people, the African family, the African community, and African institutions. So we have to have all of those things to develop healthy children. Similarly, Eurocentric space, according to Williams' model, is represented by the presence of European American family and European American community and the European American institutions. More specifically, Williams defines Afrocentric space as a social system within a broader society through which the elements of the formation of a collective Black mind are transmitted, handed down from generation to generation. Eurocentric space, on the other hand, is defined as the social system of the larger surrounding European American society. Afrocentric space is operationally defined by the Afro-specific socialization process, which Williams calls Africanizing, and an Afro-specific symbol ritual, which he calls Afrotyping. The former refers to the process of teaching and indoctrinating African-centered philosophy, beliefs, values, customs, and rituals, while the latter refers to the ritual of naming and purposing. Accepting Williams' lead in this type of critical analysis of African child development, it is important to further elaborate on these vital socialization processes. In particular, it is critical to recognize that at the substantive or operational level, Afrocentric social space is defined by its self-affirming functions. In other words, the presence of a self-affirming African family, community, and institutions organized around the overriding purpose of African nation building and maintenance. Thus, the present model would add, consistent with the Williams model, that Afrocentric developmental space is best conceived of as comprising an African-centered family home, environment organized around the purpose of African nation building and maintenance. This would consist of African parents, the presence of African-centered cultural icons and symbols, and most importantly of all, the teaching and practicing of African-centered cultural values, rituals, and activities which awaken and strengthen the African spirituality, which he has called the ASEO earlier in this book. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. And affirm the dignity, integrity, and worth of African life, as well as the prioritization of its maintenance, defense, and survival. African parents and teachers must explicitly teach and socialize African children to participate in African nation building and maintenance as their overriding goal, purpose, or Afrocentric values of life. The practice of Afrocentric cultural values and rituals are vital elements of this process. On the importance of rituals in defining Afrocentric developmental space or African cultural infrastructure, Marimba Ani observes, African life is replete with ritual. Ritual sacrifice symbolizes the principle of interdependence and reciprocity. It is through ritual that the unexplainable is understood, that chaos is made to be ordered within logic and tradition. It is through ritual that trauma is avoided, crisis dealt with and overcome, and difficult transitions are perceived as passages between stages of normal growth and development. Ritual is, in a sense, the ultimate expression of the African worldview, for it is the modality within which the unity of the human and the divine is expressed, in which the unity of spirit and matter is perceived, and in which the eternal moment is achieved. So ritual is everything to us. That's why it's important to remember our rituals and to remember our ancestors. In contrast, Eurocentric developmental spaces for African children is defined by the dominance of Eurocentric white supremacy values, rituals, and practices in defining the significant others and cultural, environmental, experiential space. This could encompass the family home environment, the school and neighborhood environments, the church, and other interfacing broader community, institutional, and societal structures impacting African life in America, such as the mass media, electronic and entertainment media, economic structure, legal and judicial structure, political structures, and so on. Williams discusses the cultural experiential space model in African personality development in terms of the manner in which Eurocentric space encroaches upon or overtakes Afrocentric space in the developmental matrix of African children, or what herein referred to as degree of psychological and cultural oppression. In other words, encroachment here refers to the process of Afrocentric consciousness coming under the control and or domination of Eurocentric space, such as their worldview and their cultural values. For example, Eurocentric space encroachment can occur anywhere from 0% encroachment, 25%, 50%, 75%, all the way up to 100% encroachment. Eurocentric cultural indoctrination in African children. So they are trying to indoctrinate our children. The Europeanization of African children in North America is carried out not only through the formal and systematic process of cultural miseducation of contemporary African family by the Eurocentric educational system, or the public food system as we call it here, but also by every other major institutional system in American society. The Eurocentric Black equals African church and religious practices, and of course the omnipresent Eurocentric mass electronic or high-tech media systems play a particularly powerful cultural indoctrinating role along with the American educational system. Virtually every media system in this country glorifies Eurocentric values, characteristics, rituals, and customs as dictated by the European worldview. Television and radio, videotapes, audio cassettes, CDs, books, DVDs, magazines, newspapers, and films all project content which serves this function. Literally all African children are impacted by the Eurocentric media, and most African parents as well, because they are not sufficiently prepared through Afrocentric cultural development and inoculation to propel or reject it, nor are they trained to understand it and counteract it effectively. Neither our family home training nor our indigenous community-based systems of socialization, education, and indoctrination prepares us to effectively defend ourselves against the all-pervasive Eurocentric psychological assault on our minds, and it is consistent and ongoing. Hence, African children are bombarded with European role models or Europeanized African role models, some combination of Eurocentric physical, cognitive, and behavioral traits. Through their constant media exposure in their parents' anti-African Eurocentric self-presentation, values, and behaviors, and in the anti-African or Eurocentric values throughout virtually every aspect of their formal educational experience. Needless to say, this culturally oppressive condition of African child development, when combined with the other Eurocentric oppressive forces throughout our society, can be and often is devastating to most African children. So it is our job to teach them and to give them that African self-consciousness, because if we don't, this system is going to tell them to destroy themselves. Suicide rates are on the rise in our young because they can't handle all of this anti-Blackness, anti-African media that they're consuming, whether it's on social media, whether it's at school, in books and magazines that they read. And we make jokes about it because there's a joke going around that shows a white man with a headdress on that says they really told us these were the ancient Egyptians in our history and social studies books in school. And we try to laugh about that. And as adults, we can laugh about that, but we have a duty to teach our children that no, that's not it. They were Black. They were Black. And we have to give them imagery and show them and tell them the truth, because if we don't, this society will put them in a mindset to destroy themselves because they don't fit in. Anyway, the psychological profile of the so-called healthy African child or personality under Eurocentric socialization conditions could be organized around such basic Eurocentric dispositions as fragmented personal self-esteem, misdefined as independent of cultural self-esteem, which will probably vary with one's individual circumstances. In other words, your economic circumstances. Because while money is not the great divider, money can make you feel like you have transcended Blackness, but not until you get to the point where you're in the good old boys club and they're telling their good old boys jokes, where you realize that no, money does not make you transcend your Blackness. Low racial self-esteem, similarly misidentified as independent of personal cultural self-esteem, individualism, materialism, competitiveness, and aggression. These would also include a deeply rooted inferiority complex and compensatory behaviors of all kinds to mask such inferiority, insecurity, fear, and anxiety feelings, intense intrapsychic conflict resulting from cultural misidentification, as well as numerous other types of anti-African psychological expressions. So you get all messed up in the head when you think that you have transcended Blackness, because in this society, you cannot transcend Blackness. One of the most unpredictable personal characteristic of such culturally oppressed African child would be their level of self-esteem. This Eurocentric trait is so unpredictable because of its fragmentation to personal, racial, cultural, academic, athletic, and social self-esteem dimensions, among others. Each of these fragmented dimensions of self-esteem depend on one's individual circumstances in life, both developmentally and situationally. For example, some African children, especially if they are very dark complexioned and carry bold African features, may very likely receive great personal punishment and mostly negative reinforcement at home, in school, and in the broader community under white supremacy dominated socialization. On the other hand, an African child with different physical characteristics may not receive such negative feedback. To some extent, African children, irrespective of physical characteristics, who enjoy greater access to economic resources and grow up around other African children, or in some cases, even Europeans, may also generally exhibit higher levels of personal esteem than others. So money makes a difference in this instance. Overall, however, it will depend on how easily the African child accommodates to the European supremacy reality by accepting it as his or her reality. This determines the level of physical and direct psychological negativity that defines his or her socialization process. Thus, under conditions of Eurocentric socialization, African children might exhibit the entire range of feelings of personal esteem, from extremely low levels of self esteem to extremely high levels of self esteem, depending on their individual socialization circumstances. Almost all African children, so victimized, however, will invariably possess a moderate to severe racial cultural inferiority complex. In other words, how racial cultural self-esteem to moderate to strong, a moderate to strong materialistic orientation, competitiveness, and aggression, and almost without exception, a strong individualistic orientation. So you think that you're the exceptional Negro because you have competed your way to the top, or your parents have fought their way into being the only ones in the neighborhood. Hence, their perceptions and behavior will manifest anti-African content, and these manifestations will likely increase as they grow older, as they are permitted to engage in more and more independent action. In short, African, the collective African life, achieves a very low value in the psychology of Europeanized African children. The Europeanized African child or personality is thus characterized by a weak African self-consciousness in their psychological infrastructure. Therefore, African nation building and maintenance would be the very last item, if it exists at all, on the Europeanized African child's agenda, because their lives have been thrust or organized around the prioritization of European nation building and maintenance. The ultimate outcome or product of Eurocentric socialization, in actuality, cultural oppression of African children, can only consist of African self-determination, which results from the prioritization of European nation building and maintenance throughout every important facet of their lives. This indeed constitutes a most dangerous condition for the African world. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thank you so much for tuning in. African personality development, developing and maintaining strong African self-consciousness, or ASC, in African children. As the question was posed earlier, what then should constitute the appropriate African cultural centered model of African parenting? That is, what is Afrocentric parenting? What should Afrocentric child rearing consist of? The ASC model of African child development was, as noted earlier, prioritizes African nation building and maintenance, which encompasses the practice of African cultural centered rituals, that is, rites of transformation that occur, in fact, throughout the life cycle, as the key to a strong ASC development and maintenance. Let us look, for example, at a set of life cycle African cultural centered rituals, rites of initiation and transformation, which define the Afrocentric developmental life space of the healthy African personality. In other words, these are Afrocentric life cycles, cultural processes, which reinforce the ASC and the ASEO, thus African nation building and maintenance. These African cultural centered life cycle processes are summarized in Table 5, which we will go over momentarily. These rituals or rites of transformation throughout the developmental lifespan of the African personality are surrounded by and or organized around a full-fledged cultural-centered community system. In other words, an ongoing broad agenda for African cultural-centered ritual cycles, such as an African cultural-centered calendar of observances and celebrations that affirm and reaffirm African life, African history, African culture, and African nation building and maintenance. These include the observations and celebrations of the birthdays and physical passing or death day of our African heroes and heroines, significant African historical events such as the Haitian Revolution and the African Maafa or Holocaust of European enslavement. This would also include the observances of other historical and natural events of a geological cosmic nature, such as lunar cycles that have been traditionally observed by our ancestors, and such cultural events as Kwanzaa and other African heritage observances. From this model, we can see then where the traditional oppression created approach to socialization and development of the African child and the African personality has been in great error. This fundamental error in our approach to child personality development has no doubt led to the obvious contemporary breakdown of the psychological and cultural development of African children. African family socialization has been essentially Eurocentric in focus. African peer group socialization has been essentially Eurocentric in values and focus. And our formal education and religious socialization and indoctrinations have been Eurocentric in values and focus. Thus, African children in America have been caught up in the pathological Eurocentric encroachment dilemma or paradox, unwittingly co-orchestrated by too many miseducated African parents, too many miseducated African educators, and Eurocentric schools and educational models, too many miseducated African religious leaders and community leaders, and too many miseducated African scholars who are supposedly experts in this area and who have been providing guidelines for the African community's redevelopment. The challenge which this African-centered model proposes is one of how do we develop a strong African-centered ASC personalities in African children and adults as we move into the 21st century. To meet this challenge, we must seek to develop an ASC developmental model. Now, he provides a table here that goes through 8 different phases of life. It is called the African-centered life cycle rituals of initiation and transformation rites and developmental timetable. Greetings, Field Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Recognition of conception of ceremonial rite. 3 months pregnancy. Focuses on the recognition of the special gift, sacredness, and continuity of African life, anticipated responsibilities and obligations of the family and community. It focuses on the anticipation of the new life potential, critical participation in the African nation building mission of the family and community. So 3 months, when you're 3 months pregnant or during pregnancy, we should have this ritual as a family. We call it a baby shower sometimes, but we should repurpose the baby shower towards this so that it is more African-centered. Naming ceremonial rite. It can happen shortly after birth up to 2 years. Focuses on communal, which is the family and community recognition of the new member, and African continuity through selection of and conferring of a traditional African name and dedication of the newborn's life to the primary mission of African nation building and maintenance. Childhood ceremony should happen when you're 3 to 8 years old. Focuses on family and community conveying the role and conveying of role expectations, such as your responsibilities and obligations for the African child's participation in the family and community's mission of African nation building and maintenance. It emphasizes at between 3 and 8 years old, it emphasizes the sacredness of an African life, African continuity, and African survival through ancestral communion, complementary female and male qualities, the commitment of African-centered excellence in the development of Ma'atan principles and qualities in character, social and conduct, relations, and creative abilities and skills and development for African leadership. Happens between the time that they are 3 and 8 years old. So we don't have to wait until they're teenagers to get into this. Adolescence rite of passage. It happens between the ages of 9 or between the ages of 13 and 17 years of age. Focuses on preparation for more substantive participation in African nation building and maintenance work through Afrocentric female and male adulthood roles and functions, both physically, mentally, and spiritually, within the African community, through crystallizing, heightening communal expectations for his or her obligations and responsibilities to the African community. Also, same as the last part of number 3, the childhood ceremonial rite, which refocuses on the ancestral communion, complementary male and female qualities, commitment of African-centered excellence in the development of Ma'atan qualities and character, conduct and social relations, and creative abilities and skill development for African leadership. The adulthood initiation rite happens between the ages of 18 and 39. Focuses on recognizing the young man or woman's new status within the African community, his or her communal obligations in African nation building and maintenance, and the resources and reciprocations that accompany African adulthood, preparation of an Afrocentric Ma'atan adult life, selecting career, vocation, and other activities geared toward the fulfillment of African nation building and maintenance, preparation for marriage and African familyhood and parenting, and the responsibility for mentoring, apprenticing younger members of the community. Middle age rite of passage happens between the ages of 40 and 59. Focuses on passage through the midpoint of life and the personal reflecting, accounting for his or her African-centered Ma'atan principles in African nation building and maintenance, as witnessed by the community elders, peers, family, and children, and taking on the critical responsibility of leadership and mentoring or apprenticing younger members of the community. Elevation of leadership initiation rite happens between the ages of 60 to 70 years old or above, basically anytime between 60 and death. Focuses on the critical role of eldership in the African community and the special authority, privileges, obligations, and responsibilities that accompany it, and the reciprocations incumbent on this distinguished process of African cultural continuity, such as providing leadership and wise counsel to the community and mentoring apprenticing younger members of the community. It also focuses on personal preparation for ancestral status and Ma'atan judgment. Number 8, physical death, elevation to ancestralhood passage rite. This rite may occur either as one ceremony, a two-stage ceremony, or as two separate ceremonies. It focuses on the communal or the family and the community's celebration of the physical, spiritual life and Ma'atan legacy of the departed in relation to African nation building and maintenance. The interconnectedness of the community to the departed, the laying of the body of the departed to rest funeral, and the escorting of the deceased African spirit to the realm of the ancestors. So as you can see, there are stages and phases of life and things that we participate in, but we don't call it that. There are things that can have an African-centered focus if we just repurpose some of the ceremonies we already use. These are things that my family does. We repurpose a lot of our ceremonies. That's something that I started. So we have to get to the point where we're looking at these events that occur in life through an African-centered focus. The ASC development in African personality is therefore dependent upon the presence of Afrocentric social space, defined by Afrocentric parenting strategies and traditional African-centered values, rituals, and customs organized around the overriding purpose of African nation building and maintenance. African nation building and maintenance should be your overriding prevailing thought. This is the appropriate Afrocentric developmental socialization framework in which the African child is to grow and develop to African-centered cultural maturity. Thus, the ideal track or pattern of ASC development would entail African cultural-centered parental values and early childhood socialization experiences within the family geared toward African nation building and maintenance. It also encompasses other significant institutional indoctrinating support systems during childhood, such as African-centered peer groups, neighborhood and community environments, schools, religious practices, media, economic system, political system, etc. Of course, the actual developmental pattern of experiences for most African children, especially African children in America, does not conform to this ideal pattern. More often than not, the strength of ASC development is consistent with a developmental path or pattern defined by some degrees of Eurocentric space encroachment and or cultural imposition in one or more of the critical developmental areas indicated above. The appropriate and correct developmental path, as well as alternative developmental paths available to African children in their ASC development under white supremacy domination, can therefore be formulated based on this model. The general parameters of these contrasting developmental paths for ASC are illustrated in the ASC developmental pathways diagram that we just talked about, and there are a few revisions that have happened over time. It was actually adapted from R. Williams in 1981 with a few revisions. As can be seen in the dual pathways illustrations, when the African child development follows the natural Afrocentric path, the top path with the fully blackened heads, those culturally balanced experiential conditions which form the foundation for cultivating growth and development toward optimal African personality functioning. In other words, African nation building and maintenance began very early in the child's life cycle. In fact, under optimal experiential and socio-environmental conditions, as could be seen in the African-centered life cycle rituals, it begins before the child is actually born. Because remember, it began at 3 months post-conception. Thus, African cultural centered developmental space is absolutely essential to a strong African self-consciousness development in African children, and therefore to the ultimate African developmental outcome of African nation building and maintenance. You see, he has a theme here. He's talking about how to nation build and how to maintain it. And every child you bring into the world has a purpose in that scheme of African nation building and maintenance. On the other hand, however, when the African child's development follows the Eurocentric incorrect developmental path, the lower path culminating in the fully whitened heads, in other words, that path laid down by the European worldview indoctrination of the African family and community, a weak ASC is the developmental outcome for African children. As can be seen, the African child exposure to Eurocentric cultural centered space vis-a-vis Eurocentric cultural socialization and indoctrination processes also begins very early in the African child's life cycle, when we are most vulnerable. Hence, the outcome of weak ASC development, or what I call severe cultural misorientation, a book that we read earlier with this book club that he'll talk about later in this book in the next chapter, is clearly unavoidable under such anti-African developmental conditions. An Afrocentric profile of an African child in America. After we have provided the African child with the appropriate developmental foundation through the developmentally structured arrangement of African cultural centered rituals and an African centered experiential developmental environment, which cultivates and nurtures African spirituality and consciousness, what kind of personality outcome should we expect? A strong ASC in African children, no doubt, expresses itself in some interesting and different ways. For example, Afrocentric children at the younger age ranges, such as those between 1 and 3 and 4 and 7 years of age, should at least be developing or have developed a solid sense of their African racial identity and a positive valuation of it relative to non-Africans. In addition, they should have a beginning and rudimentary sense of the central importance of African nation building and maintenance, and developing perhaps a simplistic paradigm for the understanding pro and anti-African behavior and ethics, etc., such as the naming and childhood rights rituals. In other words, they should be at the early ages of 1 to 7, be able to identify some objects and some activities that are good versus not good for African people. They should also be able to, based on their regular experience of an Afrocentric, balanced, developmental, and more formal educational environment, have some elementary knowledge of African cultural practices, rituals, history, and creative productions such as art, prose, poetry, music, and song. As this knowledge and conceptual psychological posture becomes more developed with age, older African children, such as those in the 8 to 12-year range or pre-adolescence, should have developed a more assertive, self-affirming, Ma'atan disposition, reflecting a strong sense of collective African identity, and be capable of early African self-fortification, self-preservation, and self-defense manifestations. Their destiny of African nation building and maintenance should also become crystallized. Adolescents between the ages of 13 and 18 should also be able to develop these African-centered psychological qualities, even further to the point of being able to form and develop substantive action patterns reflective of rudimentary African institution development, like African cultural centered peer groups, programs, and activities. African history study groups in the school and neighborhood community areas of people activity and demonstrate a growing substantive sense of obligation and responsibility to the broader African community in nation building and maintenance. Substantive training in the African manhood and womanhood roles and functions in African nation building maintenance characterize this critical period of development. Thus, the Ma'atan qualities of Afrocentric social advocacy and social initiatives should become an integral part of one's personal behaviors repertoire during the adolescent period of development. Again, all of these Afrocentric personality attribute developments in African children presume active African-centered parenting, significant others, and community institutional support systems. As was pointed out earlier, mature or strong African self-consciousness development is characterized by those ASC defining qualities outlined in Chapter 3. A mature African personality with a strong sense of ASC has been stated would be one who has a strong sense of her collective African identity. In other words, a conscious collective sense of self and African spirituality at the core of her being. This would require the African person to define herself in collective communal terms, recognizing that she is obligated to the community and that she can have no meaningful existence outside of the community. In other words, the I is the we. Her beingness is tied to the African community, past, present, and future, of which it is her destiny to serve, to reaffirm throughout her life, and to defend and protect with her life. Such an African person would also possess a commitment of increasing her knowledge of her African history and cultural heritage in the world, and to develop cultural institutions to preserve and perpetuate the African cultural affirmations in the world. Such a person then recognizes the necessity of African self-transformation as a lifelong process and requires African-centered institutional mediums and support systems to carry out this vital process of African affirmation. Thus, the mature African personality sees her role and function in African nation building and maintenance as the center of her universe of life priorities. The psychologically healthy African person, therefore, is committed to affirming African life in all aspects of her life, in her interactions with African women, with African men, and with African children. Finally, an African person with a strong African self-consciousness reflects a psychological posture of vigilant defense and uncompromising resistance against any anti-African energy that she encounters. This means forceful resistance and rebuttal of anti-Africanness and exacting appropriate retribution when African life is harmed, injured, or destroyed. Thus, the psychologically healthy African person defines herself as a communal being, as one with the African community and with the commitments, obligations, and responsibilities to always affirm African life through African nation building and maintenance activities. She strives to live and to regulate her life in accordance with the cardinal African ontological principle of Ma'at. In other words, balance, truth, righteousness, justice, reciprocity, and harmony. As noted earlier, the Africanity core dictates that psychologically healthy African personalities consciously strive for African survival and maintenance through authentic African self-expression and transformation and actualization of the Africanity core of Ma'at. It is so very critical that African parents take a definitive Afrocentric position, not only verbally, but more importantly, behaviorally and operationally as well, in their general functioning in African child rearing, and particularly in relation to the African nation building and maintenance destiny of African children. The long held and dominant idea in traditional circles of African parenting victimized by white supremacy domination has been that the truth will be too negative or too traumatic for the African child to be taught, because it might negatively arouse or provoke anger and hostility toward Europeans. So historically, we didn't teach our history because they thought that it would arouse or evoke anger and hostility towards Europeans. But they are our enemy, and we need to say it out loud. Direct her development toward vulnerability and suppression and or attack and assault by white supremacy forces. African parents must finally discard these kinds of notions as utter white supremacy nonsense and start directly preparing our children to be knowledgeable of and preserve and effectively defend their African integrity through an impenetrable cultural self-fortification of strong African self-consciousness. The very nature of this long-standing socio-politically naive approach to African child rearing actually warps and retards African children developmentally, since they are invariably under constant white supremacy domination threats and are constantly exposed to white supremacy domination attacks by the very nature of their condition of racial cultural oppression. In other words, they are living under white supremacy rule domination in American society and throughout the African world makes them vulnerable every second of every day, whether African parents prepare them for it or not. Consequently, it is mere fantasy for African parents to think that there could be any consideration of a choice to prepare them or not prepare them under our existing conditions. Anthony McPhail says, how do we apply these African principles to change the minds of some of our sisters and brothers out there that being a gangster or a bad bee isn't empowerment? We have to lead first and foremost by example. We cannot tell them to cuss the white man out at their job if we don't have a job for them. We can't tell them to lift up their heads and dress right, and that being a sleep around person or a bad bee or a gangster isn't the life if that's what we ourselves are doing. So we have to first be the example that they need to see in the world. Second of all, we need to begin to provide institutions and places that benefit them. So bad bees like to go to the club, gangsters like to go party. So we need to have organizations and institutions that offer them an alternative to that lifestyle, an alternative place, because it's not all boring to be righteous and to be ma'atin. It's not boring to live upright. It's not boring to be Burkina Faso, to be an upright man. None of these things are boring, but we have to show them what it is to live that life, and we have to make it interesting and cool. I saw a group, and I've forgotten, I think they were Igbo, and they were dressed in their African garb, and they were dancing, and they were doing all manner of African centered things, but they just had on their African garb, and they were dancing to the beat, and they were coupled up. They were in pairs, and they all looked really good. And one had on red, and one had on yellow and green and blue. And that was an example of what it is to be in the life. So we have to start, it can't be a secret anymore. It can't be something that we hold in anymore. We have to show people the way, because monkey see, monkey do. Didn't Carl tell us that? Monkey see, monkey do. So people have to see the example, and I'm not calling our people monkeys, so that's not it. I'm just saying that that's what's said. But we have to get to the point where we are showing them and being the example that they need to see of this righteous life that we talk about wanting them to live. So I'll tell you what I've done recently is I've cut my hair, and I have bought my ceremonial clothes, and I have I'm building my altar, and I am trying to integrate the things that I know into a more everyday aspect of my life, so that people are seeing it, so that it's not just in my head rolling around, and it's not just in my house, but when someone looks at me, they can look at me and know that I'm different and that I'm chosen. I'm doing things so that people can see the differences in the life that I have decided to live versus the life that other people decide to live. I am working on getting a group home together. I'm working on trying to figure out how to do something about all of these orphan children and whether or not I can be a foster parent. I'm working on a lot of different things so that we can get to the point where we can show them that there's another life out there for them versus the streets. So that's how we do that. Because it's not empowerment. Being a bad bee and being a gangster is not empowerment. All right, where was that? Consequently, it is a mere fantasy for African parents to think that there could be any consideration of a choice to prepare them or not prepare them under our existing conditions. So we have to prepare our children to deal with the fact that these white people are our enemy, and they have been our historic enemy for generations, and they do us no good. They do us, they have nothing in store for us. They have nothing promising for us. They are doing us no good. They have no good intentions for us. And we have to tell them our history of enslavement. I was talking to my niece about the fact that, listen, these white people cannibalized us. They ate us. They made shoes out of us. They ripped our children out of our bellies when we were pregnant. They castrated our men. They cut off our breasts. They made us breastfeed their children. They did a lot of things, all the while calling us inhuman. They procreated with us and made children that they didn't want to accept as their own. And she's 13, so she's been hearing these stories for a few years. But, you know, she had to do a project, and her teacher was talking to her about it, and her teacher was surprised she knew so much, because I kept it real with her. I'm telling her, no, these people are your historic enemy. And you can be cool with them, but they can't be your buddy, your friend, your pal, because when they your buddy, your friend, your pal, Black kids wind up dead or degraded when they hang out with white kids. And that's not what I want for your life. Period, point blank. Hence, strong African self-consciousness development through life cycle rituals and annual cultural celebrations and observances. So the death day and birthdays that we know of our most empowered ancestors. You can begin to celebrate these holidays, but you have to tell yourself the truth about what these holidays meant. They were all forms of ethnic cleansing of Black people. They were all forms of ethnic cleansing of Black people. They were all celebrations of your European domination of a people. So you can celebrate them, but make it a day of actual remembrance. I'll get more into that in another broadcast, but we will talk about these holy days. But what he's talking about, rituals and observances, are death days and African liberation days, and specifically Kwanzaa, and specifically the days that Africans were liberated, like, whether it's January 1st or June 6th, Juneteenth or June 16th, or whatever days you want to celebrate. But different countries had their liberation occur on different days. You can celebrate those days. But you have to get to the point where you are Africanizing everything and every aspect of things that you do. One of our major problems in this area has been our miseducation to the truth of African life, the African condition in the world, African history, and our collective destiny of African nation building and maintenance. This fundamental conceptual deficit in our liberation plan, irrespective of the kind of liberation that we have sought, has left African parents in the very insecure and confused state as to what our African truth really consists of. We will focus on an explanation of this problem in chapter 6, which is the next chapter, which will be next week. Thus, culturally centered or Afrocentric African child development is anchored in the truth of African social reality in America and throughout the world, and the collective destiny of African people to rebuild, maintain a strong and impenetrable African world order. You hear that? That is your job, to rebuild and maintain a strong African world order, an impenetrable African world order. The forecast says you can't be friends or reason with psychopaths. You can't. You're absolutely right. Oh, and thank you, Sister Raw, for recognizing the work that I'm trying to do. Thank you for recognizing the work that I'm trying to do. I appreciate you so much. In conclusion, this analysis is so very crucial to the survival of Africans in America, because Africans are constantly fed a psychological diet of white supremacy domination or European glorification and deification. They even made God white. And African inferiority, often from the very moment that they are born. And I will add this: it happens before you're born, because they tell your mama what medication to put in her body so that it can get to you. So their attempts at colonization and wrangling in and controlling the African mind happens even before you're born, because they try to tell you they tell your mother what medicines to take while she's pregnant with you. And it's not natural. It's not always natural. There are different vitamins that we need that I'm not 100% sure on all of them, but there are different vitamins that we need for our better development that they don't even talk about. African children are caught up in the unwitting conspiracy between the miseducated Europeanized African parents, miseducated Europeanized African educators, the miseducated Europeanized community leaders and role models, and miseducated Europeanized African scholars, surrounded by, defined, and upheld by the European social system of white supremacy rule and domination over Africans. So everything is working against our babies. And if we don't take up for our children, then who will take up for our children? It is thus a conspiracy of miseducation and cultural misorientation, or psychological submission to white supremacy, to the European worldview, which our children must somehow survive and transcend without any help or education or preparation if African people are to survive into the 21st century as a culturally viable people. Thus, in order to save the African race from utter cultural devastation and ultimate physical destruction, we, the contemporary African community, must redefine, reconceptualize, and redirect the nature and pattern of African parenting and socialization vis-a-vis African-centered community infrastructure redevelopment based on some clear Afrocentric guidelines and standards. In fact, in our reconceptualizing of this vital process, we must leave little or nothing in African child rearing or personality development open to mere chance. We have failed so miserably in this area in the past. Only then can we be successful in developing psychologically, culturally healthy future Africans in North America and throughout the African world. Only through such redefinition and redevelopment of our African cultural infrastructure, our community institutional base, will we be able to finally put an end to the literally mountainous piles of African human carnage left in the wake of white supremacy domination's unbridled and unrelenting rampage throughout the African world. We desperately need Afrocentric models of African self-consciousness development and African child rearing to reverse this dangerous and pervasive trend so characteristic of contemporary African communities around the world. The mere general outline of this crucial developmental process, which I have presented here, and the fundamental child rearing issues that it raises for us to consider, as well as some others, will be discussed in Chapter 6 and Chapter 8, which will hopefully contribute to the facilitating of our operationalizing some effective preventative intervention procedures in the near future. And that is the end of Chapter 5, my friends. So as you can see, our children are at risk. And they are at risk because we haven't told them anything. We thought that it was protecting them, or at least I know that my mother thought that she was protecting me by not talking to me ad nauseum about African-centered things. My mother was a dark-skinned woman that grew up in the 60s and 70s, that went to a school that was being integrated in the North, and she didn't feel that it was necessary to tell me her story in full when I was young. If I had known her story when I was young, I probably would have been more militant. If I had known her story when I was young, I probably would have been more militant. I would have made some different decisions younger. We would have had this conversation 20-30 years ago, instead of me just getting back on the path now, instead of it being something that I'm just now fully embracing these past 5 years. So, as you can see, we have to protect the children. And if we don't protect the children, no one else will. All right, guys, that's all I have to say. I'll be back tomorrow night reading Naeem Akbar's Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery. That is our mini book tonight. Oh, the forecast says his mom was in school during integration too, but she didn't have knowledge to be able to give it to me. We had to learn on our own. We do have to learn on our own. We do. We do have to learn on our own. There are a lot of things and a lot of opportunities that we have to learn different things and come to grips with. That was the gift that my mother gave me. The gift that she gave me was the ability for me to reason and make sense of the world and what I experienced on my own. She didn't implant any ideas in my mind, with the exception of Christianity. With Christianity, she said, it's good to have in case you need it, but if you don't, then you don't. So, she said, what matters is your intention. And so that has led me down a different path of understanding. And I'm trying to give my niece that same gift of what matters is your intention. Any book can be reasoned with to help you understand life. Any book can be used to help you reason and understand life. But your intention when approaching the material is what matters. All right, I want to thank the forecast, Anthony McPhail, Sister Raw, and I know that Koku is listening. I know that there are elders listening with Sister Raw, so I thank you all for tuning in. I know that Oni Tase is listening. I know that the Black Business Network is listening. I know that so many others are listening, and I value you. I thank you for always tuning in. Like I said, I'll be back tomorrow with African Self-Consciousness. That's our mini book this week. Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery by Naeem Akbar. That is our mini book this week. I'm trying to get you guys to where I am. I'm just ready to go and put whatever funds I have together and go off grid somewhere. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.